Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4.
All right. All right, this hearing will come to order. Welcome, everyone. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the conflict in Libya. I thank our witnesses for appearing today. We're grateful for your participation in our hearing. I will recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement before turning it over to the ranking member for his opening statement. On April 4th, Khalifa Haftar, the commander of the Libyan National Army movement, launched a military offensive against Tripoli, the Libyan capital and home of the United Nations-backed Government of National Accord. In response, pro-GNA forces joined several local militias to repel LNA incursions. Unfortunately, the LNA offensive occurred just before UN-sponsored talks were scheduled to begin on April 14th. This diplomatic track sought to reach consensus on new interim power sharing and security arrangements and on a schedule for legislative and presidential elections. The ongoing fighting has undermined a possible deal on these measures, which would have improved governance and advanced stability in Libya. The current conflict is just the latest challenge to face the Libyan people since 2011, when they threw off the despotic rule of Muammar Gaddafi. It is the largest outbreak of violence in Libya since 2014, which occurred when Haftar tried to seize power and resulted in the de facto division of the country that persists until today. According to the United Nations, since April 4th, more than 450 people have been killed, over 2,150 wounded, and more than 63,700 displaced in Libya. There are more than 665,000 migrants in Libya, and approximately 3,100 are detained in Tripoli, where they are at risk of starvation, human rights violations, or simply being caught in the crossfire between the LNA and GNA forces. Many of these migrants hail from countries other than Libya, and I'd like to share two of their stories. Haben left Eritrea in 2015 to create a better life for his family. He was kidnapped in Sudan and sold to human traffickers who tortured him for a year to coerce money from his loved ones. After his family purchased his freedom, Haben was put on a boat intercepted by the Libyan Coast Guard in the Mediterranean. He is still in prison in Libya and fears his son will grow up fatherless. Yasser is a refugee from Darfur whose village was burned down by the Janjaweed militia. He escaped Darfur in 2016. His smugglers, however, refused to release him and brought Yasser to Sabrata in western Libya, where he was tortured until the militia holding him fell to GNA forces in October 2017. However, he was not allowed to leave Libya and remains imprisoned in appalling conditions. These are just two of hundreds of thousands of migrant stories, yet the Libyan conflict is not only a humanitarian crisis, but it is one that directly threatens the United States' interest. Libya lies just south of Europe, only a few hundred miles across the Mediterranean from Italy and Greece. It is home to the 9th largest proven oil reserves in the world, and until the recent uptick in violence, produced approximately 1.1 million barrels of oil per day. Libya also contains an ISIS affiliate that engages in brutal violence and seeks to launch attacks throughout North Africa and into Europe. U.S. Special Operations Forces recently withdrew from Libya because of the current offensive, reducing pressure on ISIS fighters in the country. Russia also provides Haftar with military assistance and likely hopes to gain access to territory that would allow it to cement its influence in North Africa and the central Mediterranean and further its goal of fomenting chaos on Europe's southern border and the Middle East broadly. Regional powers, the UAE, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey, provide support to the warring parties, which stokes their rivalry and heightens tension throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Therefore, the United States cannot afford to ignore the Libyan conflict. A well-defined, vigorous U.S. policy is necessary to prevent greater instability, stem the growing humanitarian crisis, and facilitate political reconciliation in Libya. Unfortunately, recent U.S. policy has been confused, inconsistent, and counterproductive. Before the outbreak of fighting on April 4th, the United States joined other members of the UN Security Council in supporting the UN-sponsored political process. On April 7th, Secretary of State Pompeo stated U.S. opposition to the LNA offensive, publicly urged Haftar to halt his attack, and claimed his unilateral military campaign against Tripoli is endangering civilians and undermining prospects for a better future for all Libyans. However, only 8 days later, President Trump held a phone call with Haftar and praised Haftar's significant role in fighting terrorism and securing Libya's oil resources. President Trump reportedly failed to urge Haftar to agree to a ceasefire or to return to the political reconciliation process. And whether the president realized it or not, many on the ground in Libya and around the world perceived that phone call as tacit support for Haftar and the LNA movement. The call significantly undermined the United Nations and the GNA and hindered attempts to broker a political solution to the conflict. Moving forward, it is imperative that the administration articulate a clear U.S. policy in Libya. The United States must convince outside powers to end their military support to the warring parties. With the exception of Russia, the United States maintains strong relationships with all the states intervening in Libya. The assistance these states provide to their Libyan patrons perpetuates the conflict, fosters greater instability, and must cease. The United States should also support an immediate ceasefire, reiterate its commitment to political reconciliation, and unequivocally reject any military solution to the Libyan conflict. Only a political process can secure U.S. interests, stabilize Libya, reduce the threat of terrorism, and most importantly, provide peace and opportunity to the Libyan people. With that, I will now turn to Ranking Member Wilson for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Deutsch, for calling this timely hearing. We're all concerned about the recent resumption of sustained violence in Libya as Eastern forces led by General Khalifa Haftar clash with forces loyal to the internationally recognized Libyan Government of National Accord, or GNA, near Tripoli. Nearly 8 years after Gaddafi's removal, the situation in Libya appears worse than ever. Despite backing by the United Nations, the Western-based GNA has not been able to consolidate control of the country and provide a real measure of security. The political and military divisions that have plagued Libya ever since the 2011 intervention in the country has now erupted into the worst bout of violence since 2014. 443 people have already been killed, over 2,000 wounded, and over 60,000 civilians displaced. Armed militias, some with ties to GNA, others linked to General Haftar's Libyan National Army, have all profited from the chaos in the country by smuggling drugs, weapons, and people. The recent clashes between the GNA and LNA aligned forces can also breathe new life into the terrorist groups like al-Qaeda's local affiliate, Ansar al-Sharia, which has already vowed to fight Haftar's forces in Tripoli. ISIS in Libya has also exploited the security vacuum in the country, steadily increasing its activity throughout 2018 and launching an attack in central Libya in April and an attack on Haftar's forces in the south earlier this month. And as we've seen in other conflict zones, the renewed clashes between the GNA and LNA-aligned forces will only re-energize illicit elements in the country, both criminal networks and terrorist groups that will be the main beneficiaries. Compounding Libya's many problems are the host of international actors backing different sides in the conflict. Despite the international community's endorsement of the GNA, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Russia have sided with Haftar's forces. Russia has actually been supplying the LNA with parallel Libyan currency to keep it afloat. Meanwhile, Qatar and Turkey have provided support to Islamist militias fighting the LNA, fostering a dangerous network of armed militias across the country. While some were hopeful that Libya was headed toward reconciliation after the meeting between Haftar and GNA Prime Minister-designate Siraj in Abu Dhabi in February, the renewed clashes have been the eventuality make that ever more remote. Meanwhile, Haftar's forces have made significant advances in over the past year and a half, seizing the country's major oil infrastructure in the center and southwest. The truth is that everyone's Libya policy is failing. The United States-backed government in Tripoli has simply not been able to stabilize the country. The new reinvigorated military challenge by the LNA is further proof of that. What's more, our counterterrorism policy in the country is faltering. Instead of terrorist groups weakening, ISIS and al-Qaeda appear to be strengthened. Libya's instability is a major challenge to U.S. interests, and we need a concerted effort from this administration to make it a priority. I'm grateful that the President has nominated Richard Norland to be the next ambassador to Libya last month. Mr. Norland is a career diplomat who previously served as ambassador to Uzbekistan and Ukraine. I urge the Senate to confirm this much-needed appointee. I also urge the administration to fill the special envoy slot to bolster our Libya policy. Defeating ISIS and al-Qaeda in Libya will require an end to hostilities in Libya so that the terrorists can no longer exploit both the security vacuum and the grievances of local populations. We will not drone our way out of this mess. The Libya threat necessitates bold U.S. leadership and real political commitment to reach a comprehensive political solution that will ultimately stabilize the country. Fortunately, we're joined today by a panel of Libya experts who will begin to address these issues. I look forward to hearing their thoughts on the role Congress can play in shaping U.S. policy regarding Libya, as well as what the United States can do to facilitate real political stabilization in the country. Thank you again, Chairman Deutsch, and thank you for the witnesses being here today. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. In the interest of time, as we're expecting another vote series, we'll move directly to witness testimony. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I will now introduce our witnesses. Dr. Frederick Wary is a senior fellow in the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, focused on North Africa and the Gulf. He's been traveling regularly to Libya since 2009 and is the author of a recently published book on the country's struggle after its 2011 revolution. Dr. Wary is also a 21-year veteran of the active and reserve components of the U.S. Air Force, with tours across the Middle East and North Africa. Thank you, Dr. Wary, for being here. Thank you for your service. Ms. Doherty is next. Megan Doherty is the Senior Director for Policy and Advocacy at Mercy Corps. She previously served in the U.S. Department of State as a Senior Advisor in the Near Eastern Affairs Bureau and as Senior Coordinator for U.S. Assistance to Libya. She also served as the White House National Security Council Director for North Africa. Ms. Doherty has conducted extensive research and worked on multiple civil society and governance programs in Libya. We welcome Ms. Doherty. Mr. Benjamin Fishman is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and an adjunct assistant professor of security studies at Georgetown University. He previously served on the National Security Council, where he held several posts, including executive assistant to Ambassador Dennis Ross, director for Libya, and director for North Africa and Jordan. Since leaving government, he was a consulting senior fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies and an adjunct defense policy analyst at the RAND Corporation. And finally, Mr. Thomas Hill is the Senior Program Officer for North Africa at the United States Institute of Peace, focusing on Tunisia, Libya, and Algeria. Before joining USIP, he was a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, where he focused on reforming civilian U.S. foreign policy agencies. Most importantly, Mr. Hill previously served as senior professional staff member on the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, majority staff covering North Africa, and as a foreign affairs officer in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs at the United States Department of State. Thanks all of you for being here today. Let me remind the witnesses to please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the record. We're so grateful that all of you are here today. And Dr. Rui, we will start with you, please.
Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you here today on Libya's conflict. I join you as someone who's been visiting the country for nearly a decade and interviewed most of the key players, including the man at the center of the conflict, Khalifa Haftar. During repeated trips to Tripoli, I've also felt Libyans' frustrations at the Government of National Accord, or GNA, and I've seen the misery inflicted by the militias that are nominally aligned to that government. What these trips underscored is that there is no black and white in Libya, no easy fixes, and attempts to pick a savior or a winner have always backfired. Mr. Chairman, the current fighting is partly the outcome of exclusionary politics, economic corruption, and unresolved fractures going back to the 2011 revolution. On top of this, meddling by regional states and international missteps, including by the United States and the United Nations, have brought Libya to this point. But the ultimate blame for this war rests on the shoulders of General Khalifa Haftar and his April 4th assault on the capital. The attack follows a long pattern by Haftar of threatening democratic institutions and undermining political dialogue with military force in favor of military rule. None of the arguments for his offensive hold up to much scrutiny. There is no question that the decrepit Government of National Accord in Tripoli needs to be replaced, but that is precisely what the United Nations process was supposed to do through a national conference and elections. Haftar had even been offered a prominent position in a governing arrangement, but he rejected that in favor of the attack, which occurred just 10 days before the national conference. There is also no question that Tripoli's mafia-like militias need to be dismantled. But here again, modest but steady progress was being made to curtail their power just before Haftar's attack under the leadership of a pragmatic Minister of Interior in Tripoli with international help. And at any rate, the way to deal with entrenched militias is through political and economic tools, not a military assault with heavy weapons on civilian areas. Tragically, this war has given the militias, including a range of undesirable sanctioned individuals, a new opening that will be difficult to reverse. Haftar's counterterrorism rationale is flawed as well. The security vacuum created by this offensive has been a boon to the Islamic State, which has already increased its attacks since the war started. But perhaps the biggest fallacy concerns the notion of Haftar's decisiveness, the idea that he could quickly take Tripoli and unify the country. That has not happened, and it will not happen anytime soon. Instead, his attack has produced a widening civil war that threatens Libya's geographic coherence and is unraveling its social fabric. As the fighting drags on, oil production will come under risk, and as Haftar demonstrates his staying power outside of Tripoli, his regional backers will be tempted to increase their military assistance. We're already seeing that. In turn, the GNA-aligned forces are seeking external military help of their own. In the midst of all of this, the international response has been marked by ambivalence, divisions, and increasing support to Haftar. To move past the impasse, a robust and even-handed American response is needed. A more resolute U.S. policy in this crisis does not mean owning the Libya problem. Even modest U.S. diplomacy could prevent the country from spiraling into greater conflict. In particular, the U.S. should focus on three core areas. First, the United States should exert diplomatic leverage to dissuade regional meddlers from sending arms and material to both sides. And such pressure should also include greater congressional scrutiny of violations of the UN arms embargo and sanctions on logistical companies that facilitate those violations. Second, American diplomacy should safeguard Libya's vital oil infrastructure and prevent it from being militarized, especially by Haftar's side. In the past, in 2018, American diplomats played a very effective role in doing just that. Finally, the U.S. should use the threat of sanctions and war crimes prosecution against all sides to deter attacks on civilians, medical workers, and critical infrastructure, and to marginalize spoilers. Congress should play an important oversight role in the implementation of these measures. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, in closing, I cannot stress enough the rapidly shutting window for action. Libya stands on the brink of a dissolution that threatens American interests and the interests of our allies. The solution here is not to pick one side in this complex, multifaceted conflict, especially the side that offers the false promise of an authoritarian, military-led stability. Rather, it lies in supporting a return to dialogue and a more inclusive path. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you here today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. Ms. Doherty, you're recognized.
Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the humanitarian dimensions of the conflict in Libya. I will briefly summarize the situation on the ground and make recommendations for moving forward. But I'll first note that the deepening humanitarian crisis in Libya is entirely man-made. The civilian casualties, the violations of international humanitarian law are eminently avoidable and require a political solution. But despite the situation on the ground, there is an opportunity for the United States and the US Congress specifically to prevent further deterioration. The Libyan people have now endured a near decade of insecurity, economic dysfunction, and political instability. But before the recent outbreak of violence, Libya had made some important gains, including restarting oil production and partnering with the US to prevent ISIS from establishing a new caliphate in 2016. The escalating violence taking place now threatens to unravel these gains and destabilize Libya. And we have seen before that chaos in Libya does not stay within its borders. So the choices that we make in this crisis now will reverberate in the region. Since Khalifa Haftar launched his attack on April 4th, fighting has killed more than 450, injured more than 2,000, and displaced, as of this morning, 66,000 people. Here are the key consequences that we're seeing on the ground. There are more than 1 million people in urban Tripoli watching the front lines inch closer. The conflict, including airstrikes in civilian neighborhoods, has already killed 23 and wounded 100 civilians. 66,000 people have fled their homes. They are mostly sheltering with relatives, in schools that have been closed, in overcrowded apartments. Rent has tripled. Food prices have increased significantly. Hospitals and homes are losing access to power and clean water. People are coping as best they can, but this is not sustainable. Tripoli's already fragile hospitals are overwhelmed. In just 3 weeks, the World Health Organization emergency medical teams performed almost 250 surgeries. Hospitals and health workers are also being attacked in clear violation of international humanitarian law. There are more than 3,000 refugees and migrants trapped in detention centers in Tripoli. We've already seen terrible reports of militias firing on and wounding detained people in Qasr bin Gashar. We are now seeing more people trying to flee to Europe by sea. Those who are intercepted by the Libyan Coast Guard are returned to detention centers that are increasingly unsafe and running out of food. Those who are not intercepted face other risks. Just last week, 70 people drowned trying to cross the Mediterranean. Humanitarian responders are trying to reach people in need. They are braving ongoing shelling, checkpoints, and explosive devices that are being planted on key roads. But as the conflict continues, both sides have the ability to cut off supply lines for food, fuel, medicine, and water, not just to Tripoli, but for the rest of the country as well. Further conflict in Libya will cost more lives, damage infrastructure, and create openings for terrorist threats. And we know from experience that instability in Libya does not stay in its borders. Absent, unambiguous, high-level US pressure for a political process, warring parties on both sides will continue to fight, confident that they can do so with impunity. The United States does have unique leverage in Libya. and right now has the capacity to engage in small, low-risk ways to help reduce violence, ensure that humanitarian aid is reaching people in need, and to convince the warring parties and their foreign backers to commit to a civilian-led transition process. The U.S. should immediately call for a ceasefire, including through a UN Security Council resolution, publicly and privately reaffirm support for the UN-led political process, including through bipartisan statements from Congress, and pressure all parties to respect human rights, international humanitarian law, and to ensure safe, continued humanitarian access, including to refugees and migrants who remain the most vulnerable in this conflict. A return to a political process is vital, but more work will surely need to be done to address Libya's longer-term stability challenges. It is, however, a necessary first step to save lives and move from this conflict towards a more inclusive, Libyan-led peace process and to longer-term recovery. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Doherty. Mr. Fishman, you're recognized. Is your microphone on, Mr. Fishman?
Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, members of the committee. Libya's future as a peaceful, prosperous, and free country has never been more under threat since 2011. At the same time, the United States lacks a clear policy and strategy toward Libya, which makes this hearing especially timely. From the onset of Libya's transition, U.S. policy toward Libya has actually been relatively consistent. The U.S. has always supported the United Nations support mission in Libya, UNSMIL, and its efforts to help guide the Libyans through ups and downs, 3 elections, several transitional governments, and multiple peace initiatives. This was the policy of the Obama administration and, until recently, the Trump administration. Even the Trump administration, which I have consistently urged to pay more attention to Libya, helped support Ghassan Salame, the head of UNSMIL, initiate his 2017 action plan to reinvigorate Libya's stalled transition. The administration seemed on track to maintain this policy after General Haftar launched his brazen offensive against Tripoli on April 4th. As the chairman mentioned, on April 7th, Secretary of State Pompeo said the U.S. opposed Haftar's offensive and emphasized, quote, "there is no military solution to the Libya conflict." But several days later, President Trump called General Haftar and acknowledged Haftar's role in securing Libya's oil and fighting terrorism, Haftar's professed reason for attacking Tripoli. There was apparently no mention of a halt in fighting or returning to negotiations. Following the phone call, the U.S. refused to support a UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire, ironically joining Russia in their existing support for Haftar. The effect of the Trump call signaled American ambivalence at best toward the latest fighting in Libya. Moreover, President Trump elevated Haftar to a head of state level, playing to his ego with the likely impact of spurring on his offensive. The fight for Tripoli is now in its 41st day. The longer the conflict persists, the harder it will be to recreate an environment where negotiations and a political solution will be acceptable to either side. So what to do? First and foremost, the White House needs to establish a clear policy toward Libya. Is it in favor of Haftar, or does it support an immediate ceasefire and a return to UN-led negotiations? Either way, it must express a clear set of preferences. A good beginning would be to echo Senator Lindsey Graham when he appealed to the administration to, quote, reaffirm past statements rejecting a military solution in Libya and pushing for political reconciliation. The first priority should be halting the violence. The U.S. should lead an effort to impose an unconditional ceasefire at the UN Security Council. Second, the U.S. needs to conduct a serious effort to end outside support to Libya's warring factions. The introduction of new weapons and technologies, such as strike-capable Chinese-made drones on Haftar's side, not only threatens continued escalation in civilian casualties, but clearly violates the UN arms embargo. Finally, the U.S. has to be at the table, represented by senior officials when negotiating process resumes. A more intense level of U.S. engagement on Libya is necessary if the UN will be able to reconstitute its peace and unity efforts. Congress can also play an important role. Last September, Congressman Liu sent a bipartisan letter to then Ambassador Nikki Haley, co-signed by Chairman Deutsch and 3 additional members of this committee. It urged the U.S. to invigorate support for Salome's action plan and to discourage our partners, quote, support of proxy forces inside Libya and violations of the arms embargo. I humbly suggest this committee send a similar bipartisan letter to the White House, asking for an immediate clarification of U.S. policy on Libya and encouraging the steps outlined above. Thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fisher. Mr. Hill, you're recognized.
Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify on the conflict in Libya today. I'll be summarizing my written testimony in the interest of time. I am currently the Senior Program Officer for North Africa at the U.S. Institute of Peace, although it wasn't so long ago that I was staffing some of you on North Africa issues as the Senior Professional Staff Member on this committee for Chairman Ed Royce. It's a pleasure to be back among so many friends and former colleagues. I'd like to note that the views I express today are my own and not necessarily those of the U.S. Institute of Peace, which does not take policy positions. Today's hearing is important because the conflict in Libya represents a direct threat to U.S. national security interests. The collapse of state institutions in Libya has created a conduit for irregular migration into Europe, producing instability and increasing the threat of violence and terrorism. Unable to police its own territory, Libya is now a staging ground for terrorist attacks in neighboring Egypt and Tunisia, 2 critical allies of the United States. And these terrorists are funding their operations in part through the smuggling of weapons, goods, and people. The reports of modern-day slavery are horrific. In testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee in March of 2017, General Tommy Waldhauser, the commander for U.S. AFRICOM forces, testified that, quote, the instability in Libya and North Africa may be the most significant near-term threat to U.S. and allied interests on the continent. The strategy of allowing the United Nations to lead the international mediation effort has failed. It's failed because the UN never had the coercive ability to marginalize or control potential spoilers. It repeatedly made political miscalculations that undermined its own credibility with the Libyan people, and because states that publicly pledged to support the United Nations routinely took actions to the contrary. Field Marshal Haftar's assault on Tripoli in April began 10 days before the UN much-anticipated national conference. Many Libyans had already been openly critical of the UN's ability to end the post-Gaddafi transition after 8 years, but the timing of Haftar's assault during the visit of the UN Secretary General and Special Representative Ghassan Salameh epitomizes the UN's weakness. Today, many Libyans no longer believe the UN can deliver peace to Libya. Peace in Libya depends in large part on the actions of external governments. Since 2011, external governments have sought to advance narrow self-interests at the expense of the Libyan people. The UAE, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and France repeatedly endorsed UN Security Council resolutions which recognized the GNA as, quote, the sole legitimate government of Libya, with Prime Minister Fayez al-Sarraj as the leader of the Presidency Council. Yet each of these countries routinely took steps to undermine both the GNA and the UN while advancing their own interests through proxies. To be sure, many Libyans do bear some responsibility for the current situation. Unfortunately, many leaders have chosen to enrich themselves and put personal interests above those of national unity. The 2018 National Defense Strategy outlines how U.S. interests in Africa will be advanced, quote, by, with, and through partnerships with regional allies and states. One of AFRICOM's 4 principal lines of effort is Libya. It is time for the United States to start using its leverage with these allies to implement the National Defense Strategy, pressuring UAE, France, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Italy to play a productive role in ending Libya's conflict. Since 2012, the U.S. has been largely disengaged from Libya, but it's because of this engagement that many Libyans now see the U.S. as a potential honest broker. capable of organizing the international community around a peaceful solution in Libya and marginalizing potential spoilers, many of whom are U.S. allies. As a U.S. government organization, distinct from the executive branch, the U.S. Institute of Peace is uniquely well-suited to play a role here. USIP's work is seen by Libyans as an example of the U.S. government's commitment to peace, and USIP is one of the few organizations with a strong presence in southern Libya. Our work in Sabha and the Fezzan province broadly, facilitating community-based dialogues, allows us to engage directly with some of Libya's historically most marginalized communities. These Libyans are tired of post-Gaddafi transition period and yearn for a reconciliation process that can allow the country to heal. Given the failures of the UN-led process, it would be naive to hope that Ghassan Salameh and his team can now mediate an end to the Libyan conflict. Many of the external actors that publicly supported the UN in the past have now explicitly or implicitly endorsed Haftar's military assault, helping to make the GNA and Siraj effectively irrelevant. Some have welcomed Haftar's military campaign and perceive him as a bulwark against Islamic extremism and terrorist organizations. This is a gross misreading of the man and those within his LNA forces. As we've seen from the LNA campaign in southern Libya, the LNA is capable of horrific human rights abuses. If Haftar is encouraged to continue his campaign, we should expect to see more bloodshed, a new humanitarian crisis, and new opportunities for ISIS to emerge. Haftar has already shown his disdain for the concept of Libyan democracy. If allowed to take Libya through force, his dictatorship will not bring the stability he has promised. The United States should explore all diplomatic options for using its considerable leverage to facilitate a peaceful solution to the Libyan conflict. Again, thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. We are expecting votes to be called relatively soon. We'll turn to questions now. I'll go to the ranking member first, and we'll try to get in as many as we can. If members would like to not use the full 5 minutes, that might allow for more of us to get questions in, but Mr. Wilson, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And in line with the time constraints, first of all, I want to thank each of the witnesses. You were very thoughtful in your suggestions on how to address the utter instability in Libya. Beginning with Mr. Hill and proceeding with each of you, ISIS has staged a string of attacks in Libya in recent weeks. Can you describe the terrorist attacks' current operational capabilities in Libya? To what extent has ISIS benefited from the renewed fighting?
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Wilson. It is very clear that ISIS and other terrorist groups thrive on instability and the chaos that has ensued. To their specific capabilities at any given time, I'm not best qualified to answer that, but it is very clear that they are opportunistic, and that as government institutions are incapable or unwilling to perform the public safety mission, ISIS and others will exploit that. And as we've seen in the past, they are brutal in their terrorist assaults. So it is clear that any continuation of this violence only assists ISIS and its cohort.
Thank you. Mr. Fishman?
I agree, and Fred can talk more authoritatively on this than anyone, but Haftar's position as a counterterrorism specialist is frankly misguided. The actual people who cooperated with the U.S. government and AFRICOM in 2016, when a 6-month operation took place to rid ISIS of Sirte, were largely a group from Misrata. Those are the people that Haftar is now fighting, and those are the people that are on the defensive now that President Trump has called Haftar, and we don't know where U.S. policy stands on that.
Thank you. Ms. Doherty?
Strongly echo the points made by my colleagues. I was serving in the White House during the Sirte campaign, and we did partner with the GNA-aligned Misratan militias who are currently under attack by Haftar's forces. But I'll just underscore that it is clear that ISIS is taking advantage. We've seen, I think, 3 attacks in the last 3 weeks, and truly the only way to address this instability that they will continue to exploit is through a negotiated political process.
Thank you. And finally, Dr. Weary.
To echo what was said, ISIS is definitely on the rebound. Last year alone, they conducted about 25 attacks, including against key installations or institutions in Tripoli, the National Oil Corporation, They're confined to the desert. They've got urban cells in Tripoli. But again, just to underscore, Haftar's attack has really opened up this political vacuum. He's attacking the Misratan militias that, as we've heard, attacked the Islamic State in Sirte. I was embedded with those militias in 2016 during the battle. I saw the sacrifices they made. They received American counterterrorism support. What's happening now is because of this civil war, the militias on both sides are more focused on fighting each other than containing the Islamic State. And so it's a gift for the Islamic State. And we're seeing an uptick in attacks, and that's going to continue, unfortunately.
And I yield it back.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Connolly, I saw you standing at the door before you recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our panel. In the interest of time, I just want to ask one basic question, and I'll start with you, Dr. Wary. On April 7th, the Secretary of State, the highest diplomat in the United States government, stated unequivocally that we oppose the military offensive by Khalifa Haftar's forces and urge the immediate halt of these military operations against the Libyan capital. But 8 days later, the White House announced that the President of the United States spoke to Haftar and recognized Field Marshal Haftar's significant role in fighting terrorism and securing Libya's oil resources. After that, 4 days later, the acting Secretary of Defense, Patrick Shanahan, emphasized where we need Field Marshal Haftar's support is in building democratic stability there in the region. What in the world would account for such an enormous pivot in U.S. policy with respect to Haftar in the space of 8 days?
What I can say is probably speculation, but what I'll offer is an analysis of its effect on the battle. I think it neutralized diplomatic efforts that were underway to effect a withdrawal of Haftar's forces, to effect a ceasefire. It had a real sort of, shocking effect. Various interlocutors in the region are not, taking U.S. diplomacy. They're confused by it now. Again, I think it's a huge boon to the states that are fueling this conflict, the Arab states. So it's a gift to Haftar. As we've heard, it's a reversal of U.S. policy. You've got an internationally recognized government in Tripoli that, for all of its flaws, and I've seen those flaws, the policy in the U.S. was to support that government. Suddenly we're reversing it. It's a huge policy confusion. And so what I would urge is the U.S. needs to come out with a clearer statement on a ceasefire, walking that back, so we can get down to a return to the political process.
And just real quickly, Mr. Hill, if I understood your testimony, if we're backing Haftar or even halfway encouraging him, we're backing the wrong guy from what you said. People misunderstand who he is.
Haftar is a destructive force inside Libya. It is clear that he has personal ambitions that trump those of the country in general. I think his decision to walk away or indeed take actions to undermine the UN's national conference, which was slated to be middle of April, and then he assaulted 10 days in advance, I think that demonstrated his disdain for the United Nations and the political process in general. I don't know that there is a political solution that he would accept other than complete domination, and it raises questions about his ability to be a productive force going forward.
No good can be served if we have this kind of vacillation, profound vacillation at the highest levels of the United States government. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Mr. Watkins is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Which foreign or international actors would be the best to lead a peace process? And the other part, because I want to be brief, what actors inside Libya should the U.S. interact with, and what's the nature of that interaction?
I'll start with the Libyans. Libyans, it's a country with a relatively small population of 6 million, and there's a lot, what I would call the sort of silent majority. We're not hearing their voices. They don't support the sort of militia mafia. They're not supporting a new dictatorship. We've been, engaged in serious outreach to them for a number of years. Civil society, tribal leaders, There are many Libyans that I met in Benghazi that supported Haftar out of desperation, right? Because he promised a return to order. But they're very uneasy, and especially now, quite frankly, disgusted with how this conflict has evolved and his own personal ambitions. So the field is, I think, really ripe for American engagement. I think, as we've heard, Libyans have been ill-served by their political class. Many of these elites are just out for, sort of a scramble for the economic spoils. But there is a base that we can engage with, and we have been. As far as international states, I mean, the big problem in this is there's been these European rivalries. The French and the Italians have been pursuing different agendas. The British have been tied up with Brexit. I think the Germans have been taking a very forceful and moral stand on this. But as we've heard, I think the United States has a unique role as a relatively neutral broker. In my conversations with multiple Libyans, we're still seen as relatively neutral, and we need to capitalize on that now in this current crisis.
I'll just add on the UN process, or rather on the peace process, that the UN is still, in my opinion, the best avenue towards a negotiated political settlement that'll deliver true progress for the Libyan people. We've seen previously harmful effects by European capitals having sort of elite-led negotiations that have been largely divorced from the realities on the ground, and that the UN-led process with strong US leadership is the right way forward. And I'll caution, we should not be looking towards a binary solution of a Haftar-Sarraj sit-down. Really what we need to be doing is working with the UN to bring in the municipalities, the tribal power brokers, and the Libyans that Fred's talking about, these vibrant civil society activists and marginalized voices.
And to add to that, that's why the timing of this offensive was so egregious, because Haftar basically preempted this UN organized dialogue. There's no question that the UN efforts have stymied repeatedly over the years. The structure of compromise has been ugly. But that needs to be the center of gravity of negotiations, despite what my colleague, Mr. Hill, said. And the U.S. is the best position to reinforce the UN's ability to get the parties to the table, including to reject or to send a strong signal that other regional actors and spoilers need to step away from interfering in Libya's transition.
I think we'd all agree that the U.S. has a unique role to play and has the ability, the leverage to bring many of the players who are currently playing an unhelpful role around a table to try to talk through some of this. But ultimately, this has to be a Libyan-led process. This doesn't get resolved unless Libyans themselves are able to find a path towards reconciliation. So while the U.S. or UN, we could debate about which one should start the conversation and start to try to remove some of these external actors that have been so unhelpful, at the end of the day, this has to be a Libyan-led process.
Thank you. I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Watkins. Mr. Allred, you recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panel. I think you have brought up some very good points in your written testimonies and here today, and I think it's a very important topic. I want to begin with why the U.S.'s leadership is so critical here. You all touched on it briefly in the last question. With the Europeans having their own disagreements here, with our own regional allies putting their hands into the pot, with Russia also having some equities here, why is the U.S.'s leadership role so critical in Libya? And Dr. Wary, if you could begin.
Well, again, I think it does stem from the Libyans' memory of our support to the NATO intervention. And again, we're seen as sort of above these sort of petty squabbles that define other powers. And I think we've shown our ability in the past with some very forceful diplomacy to safeguard Libya's national institutions, especially on the oil. In the summer of 2018, American diplomats were crucial in basically persuading General Haftar to return oil installations that he'd seized to the rightful control of the National Oil Corporation. We played a huge role in reforming the central bank. We've supported counterterrorism efforts. So again, we're not seen as backing narrow agendas. Of course, our interests lie in counterterrorism, but I think that, again, the perception in Libya is that we can act as this very important broker.
Thank you. Ms. Doherty?
Thank you. So I lived in Libya right after the revolution in 2011 and 2012. I was in Benghazi and Tripoli, and then later in Tripoli in 2013 and 2014. And in those early days in Benghazi, I saw the gratitude that the Libyan people felt towards the United States, and the fact that 700,000 people in Benghazi were sheltering and thinking that they were going to be brutally massacred by a dictator, and that the United States stood up. And that legacy looms large in how they perceive the United States today. Because we don't have the colonial legacy, because that we don't have the geographic proximity, we are still seen as a neutral and a trusted and an important actor. In fact, the Libyans that I still talk to today, many of whom are in Tripoli and quite scared about what's happening right now, are asking for the U.S. to reassert itself diplomatically and play a leadership role.
Mr. Fishman?
So there's a difference between U.S. Engagement and leadership and U.S. taking ownership over the issue. President Trump sent a really significant signal in April 2017 when he said publicly with the then Italian Prime Minister, we have no role in Libya except for counterterrorism. That enabled the bureaucracy to continue helping Libya on the important technical issues that Fred mentioned, but on a political level, it really signaled to the rest of the world that the executive branch really doesn't care. That was also reflected in the fact that there have been 3 presidential level summits, 2 in France, 1 in Italy. The head of state, the representative from the United States was a mid-level State Department official, not head of state, not even Secretary of State. That sends a signal of lack of interest. I think the consensus of this group is if that leadership was elevated, we'd see far less interference by unproductive actors on the outside and maybe some progress on the UN effort.
Mr. Hill, briefly, if you could.
Thank you. There is no other country that has significant relationships with all of these countries in such a way that pressure could be brought to bear to potentially produce behavior modification. Other states may try, but the U.S. is uniquely qualified to do it.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. To me, this underscores the damage that was done by President Trump's call to Haftar. I have a very hard time understanding what this administration is doing in Libya, and I'm deeply, deeply concerned that the signals that we're sending, given, as you all have said in your written testimonies, the closing window of opportunity here for us to do something productive. So I'm glad that we're having this hearing and hope Congress can help lead on this, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Allred. Mr. Shabby, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I was in Libya in August of 2012 and spent the better part of a day and a half with our ambassador there, and he was pretty upbeat about the situation and attended an iftar dinner, and a lot of folks from the area attended that dinner, and there seemed to be a lot of camaraderie and brotherhood. And of course, a month later, that ambassador was dead along with 3 other Americans, and it seems like in many ways it's gone downhill from there, even though there have been some signs of hope, but the situation is pretty chaotic, as all the witnesses have testified here this afternoon. Ms. Doherty, let me ask you this, because you raised this particular point, that the chaos in Libya, if it isn't dealt with, if it isn't stabilized, if something positive doesn't happen, won't stay within its borders, it's going to spread throughout the region. After she answers this question, I'd be happy to any of the other panel members that might like to. What do you see as the most likely spill over to other areas. And obviously, number one is to deal with it so that doesn't happen. But where are the other spots that we should be concerned in the region? I'll start there.
Thank you for your question. The most vulnerable spot that I perceive would be Tunisia. We've already seen ISIS take advantage and cross borders. There were attacks in Ben Gardan in 2016, for example. So Tunisia, I believe, remains a great risk. Beyond that, Libya's southern borders are particularly porous, in some cases almost non-existent. And so there are threats to the Sahel that we should be looking at. And the South in particular is extremely difficult from both security and an economic perspective. So more attention in general needs to be paid there. But that is where we have seen, in fact, the most recent ISIS attacks take place. And then there's obviously the maritime border with Europe and the vulnerability that'll be exposed there if we don't have a stable government partner that we can work with.
Thank you very much. Any of the other panel members that want to touch on it, you're welcome to.
I just
Fishman?
mentioned there are tens of thousands of not only African but Asian migrants stuck in Libya, all before this latest iteration of the civil war. The Southern European countries, especially Italy, has been trying to keep them there, but long term, they got to go somewhere. Spain is now the most common route for migrants to Europe. But you're talking about tens of thousands of people and increasingly duress. Megan alluded to it in her statement that just they're so desperate that people are drowning by swimming across to find rescue boats. That situation is going to be unbearable.
Okay, thank you.
I would add that,
Yes.
while I agree with my colleague Megan about Tunisia is certainly the frontline state, and you might consider lumping Egypt in there, that also Europe is paying a huge cost for the flood of migrants, and both from a counterterrorism perspective, but also a political stability perspective. And that can't be underappreciated because it does directly impact U.S. interests. And so I wouldn't want to miss that piece of it.
Thank you.
Let me just underscore the threat to Tunisia. I mean, Tunisia's fragile democracy is already under strain. There's backsliding in terms of authoritarianism. That border, I've spent time on that border. I was actually there when the ISIS attack occurred. It's a haven for smugglers. As forces that were on that border are now drawn into the civil war, it's going to get worse. I'm very worried about a sort of securitizing of the Tunisia problem along the border. The border communities that depend on trade are going to suffer. To reiterate the concern on the South, again, I was in the South in 2017. It's a desperate situation for these communities in Niger, Chad. Some of them are being drawn into the conflict. They're being used as mercenaries by Khalifa Haftar's forces. And so this is having a devastating effect on those southern countries.
Okay, thank you. I've probably got time for one more question. Ms. Doherty, I'll make this one a quick one. As far as you had mentioned that emergency medical workers, et cetera, are under attack right now. Is there anything that we, our allies, our friends in Libya can do to protect them more? What should be done about that?
Thank you for that question. The most helpful thing would be a ceasefire and a return to a political process. And so we hope that the United States, including Congress, will stand up and push for that. Beyond that, ensuring unimpeded humanitarian access, so calling for set times at which there can be safe evacuations of civilians and the delivery of humanitarian aid. Right now, it's very messy. There are a lot of first-line responders who are endangering themselves and going to the front lines. And so if there were set times at which there would be a cessation of hostilities where aid could be delivered, that would be useful. Beyond that, the United States could ensure appropriate humanitarian response. There's a Tripoli flash appeal from the United Nations requesting about $10 million that is only partially funded. But the most important thing to do is to stand up and end this conflict.
Thank you very much. My time's expired, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Malinowski, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of you for excellent testimony. We have a tendency to think of Libya as a hopeless case, and it's easy to understand why, but I think as we discuss it, it's important to remember that it wasn't always and perhaps doesn't always need to be. We should remember that after the revolution that toppled the awful Gaddafi regime, Libya had arguably one of the most peaceful and successful multi-party democratic elections of any post-conflict society in recent memory, a civilian government that was committed to democratic principles, to working with the United States and the international community to stamp out terrorism. The promise was stolen by these armed militias, aided and abetted often by outside powers, and not sufficiently discouraged by the United States, arguably over 2 administrations, not just this one. I had the dubious honor in 2011 of meeting Hiftar in Benghazi. He was seen at the time when Gaddafi was still fighting as at least a competent commander, and so many people went to see him, but virtually everybody I met at the time already recognized him as a budding dictator or somebody who was in it for himself, and nothing that has happened since has been surprising, and you all eloquently described the pernicious role that he is playing today. So one response from this committee, a number of us today will be sending a letter to Attorney General Barr and FBI Director Wray, myself, Mr. Wilson, Ms. Wagner, Mr. Connolly, Mr. Allred, Mr. Trone, among others, asking the Department of Justice to begin an investigation of Mr. Haftar and his subordinates for war crimes. It's important to remember Mr. Haftar, in addition to all of the other things you mentioned, is a citizen of the United States and subject to our laws. And I think it's about time that we held him accountable under our laws for the crimes he is committing and the effect he is having on our interest in Libya. Let me ask a couple of questions, perhaps starting with you, Mr. Wary. Why is Russia so intent on supporting Haftar? How does this fit into Russia's overall strategy?
I think it's a mix of opportunism, economic interests. I think with Haftar there are longstanding ties. Haftar studied in the Soviet Union. Under Gaddafi, Russia had a number of outstanding arms contracts that they lost with the 2011 revolution. So they've had longstanding economic designs on Libya. They want, I think, a friendly ally. They're not 100% wedded to Haftar in my analysis and according to the analysis of Russia experts. They've engaged multiple sides in this conflict, but they have, and I want to underscore this, their role has bolstered Haftar's ability to oppose the UN process, crucially when they printed billions of dinars for him or to fund his government in the East, and there are reports that they've done that since the fighting started. They've hosted him in very high-profile, visits. So again, I think he aligns with their authoritarian vision that we see Russia backing elsewhere in the region. But I'm not sure, as we've noted, that he can deliver Libya to them. And I'd be cautious about saying that Russia's trying to pull a Syria in Libya, because the landscape in Libya is completely different in terms of what kind of army does Haftar really have. It's completely different than the Syrian army, again, and Russia's ties with Syria are much deeper than they are with the Libyan officer corps. So again, it is a pernicious role that Russia's playing, but I think it's ultimately an opportunistic one.
Got it. And how about, and just for anybody, how about the UAE? And is it true, as we've seen reported in the press, that the UAE is supplying or paying for the armed drones and other weapons that Haftar is using in the siege of Tripoli?
I could take that again. The UN panel of experts is investigating the use right now in this conflict of these Chinese-made drones that are known to be in the UAE inventory. The UAE used these in Benghazi. They have an air base outside of Benghazi from which they've flown these drones, as well as air tractor aircraft. So again, the UAE has been an important provider of close air support to Haftar that, again, was instrumental in Haftar's conquest of Benghazi. I was in Benghazi with Haftar's forces when they were stalemated. This was 2015. He was not able to move in Benghazi and conquer that city without external support, namely from the United Arab Emirates when they sent in armored vehicles and airstrikes, and then also, if we're honest, the French played a role as well as backing him.
Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Vargas, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the panel for being here today. After the murder of Ambassador Stevens back in 2012, I think the United States lost a lot of interest in Libya, frankly. I think I was on the committee for 2 years, and I went off, and I've been on financial services, came back, but you don't hear a lot about Libya other than Benghazi, and more the investigations, not the people in Benghazi or in Tripoli. And I think that that's very unfortunate, because I do think we're in a situation right now that's a crisis and growing. But I was interested in talking more about the issue as it associates with, I think people are looking at the general and thinking that Haftar does have the military strength, if he wants to take over the country, a lot like we maybe underestimated Assad. But Doctor, you said that that's not the case, that it's more our outside friends, frankly, propping him up. Is that the case?
It's been a huge part of his success. If we look at his Libyan National Army, again, it's a bit of a misnomer. It's got a core of regular units, but it's been able to collect tribal and militia units around it. Even in the Battle of Tripoli, he doesn't have sufficient manpower to go into these urban, densely urban areas. If you look at it from an actual force perspective, urban warfare, you need a lot of troops to go into urban fighting. He doesn't have that, so he's relying now on airstrikes, precision air power, and the United Arab Emirates is reportedly providing that. So again, I think the French, the Russians, the Emirates have been crucial to his military advances. And also, I'll mention his sweep across the country with these military forces was often done through negotiations with tribes and cash. He was paying, a lot of these militias in the country are rent-a-militias, right? Whoever pays them the most.
Right, well, whether he's cheating or not at war, I mean, it does seem like he has some momentum here, just to be frank, and I was trying to figure out, I think many of us, were the changes in opinion so quickly from the administration when you have the president saying one thing and his top diplomat saying another thing. That maybe the president just believes that this is the guy that's going to win, so we better have a good relationship with him. Otherwise, we're going to lose him to Russia. I mean, it almost seems that way, but that's why I'm curious that you don't have that view at all.
I don't at all. I mean, it took him 3 years to win Benghazi. He's stalled on the outskirts of Tripoli now. The reports I'm getting is it's almost equally matched. I mean, he's not able to move in. So he's not delivering as he's promised.
Would anyone disagree with that?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No,
I didn't mean to
even in
interrupt.
the areas of the south where he's conquered. The big thing earlier this year, he moved across the south, and everyone said, oh, he's securing the south, the oil fields. Those forces have left, right? The south is now back to the way it was before he arrived. So it's a very loose definition of territorial control.
Mr. Hill, would you agree with that?
Entirely. From all reports, it looks like Haftar's forces have stretched their supply lines to the max. He does not have the ability to move further in fact, is now seeking other military routes to create new supply lines so that he can change tactics because the current siege has not worked or has not produced the results that were intended from his perspective. So I would agree 100% with Fred.
Doherty, how about yourself?
I would say that 6 weeks of fighting have proven that Khalifa Haftar is not able to take Tripoli quickly.
But not quickly, but able to take it. Is he able to take it? I mean, I think the practical sense, 6 weeks is not, it's a large city, obviously.
Right. Well, it did take him 3 years to take Benghazi, so if we're in for the long haul, we're looking at an extremely protracted conflict with significant repercussions. But I would say the reports that we're seeing are that the fighting is largely stalemated, and the true game changer would be additional foreign support to Haftar to move the battle.
Mr. Fishman?
I think Haftar's foreign backers were sold a bill of goods, where when they talked to Haftar, even Mohammed bin Salman, 10 days before this Haftar's move on Tripoli, he was Crown Prince was probably reassured by Haftar's presentation that all would be go smoothly. That clearly hasn't been the case.
He's right.
And the danger is that the Saudis will give him money or the UAE will give him more drones. And that's why a U.S. effort to push back on this support is especially timely, because I think it could work when these guys are
My time is up, but I agree with that, and I hope we do get back to this peace process. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Farkas. Mr. Liu, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for calling this hearing on Libya. Question for Mr. Fishman. Public reporting is that Haftar visited Saudi Arabia in the days before he launched his military campaign. Are the Saudis supporting Haftar?
I can only go by reports. I think the visit definitely elevated Haftar's position in the Sunni Muslim world and elevated his position among his Salafi followers. But the extent of the support that the Saudis are actually giving him, I can't state definitively.
UAE is providing him support, correct?
This has been historically the case.
What is your sense of, and this is for the panel, of the support that Haftar has among the people in Libya?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious, given his inability to take Tripoli, that he does not enjoy support across the country that he thought he did. It may be that he anticipated that the fractious nature of the militias and groups within Tripoli would play to his advantage, but those groups all coalesced in an anti-Haftar coalition. So there is a significant and real anti-Haftar sentiment that exists in the country, and I would be skeptical about his ability to unite, or whether or not he should even be seen as a uniter. I'm not sure that that's his objective.
I'll just echo that. I was in Tripoli before this started, and some groups in Tripoli, they were so fed up with the militias in Tripoli, they were ready to welcome him in peacefully. But then the way he's conducted this war, he's really turned public opinion against him. Ordinary citizens, militias in Tripoli that were fighting each other are now unified against him. And I'll just mention in the east, in Benghazi, where he really rose to power, there were people that backed him out of desperation. Again, he promised order. You know, he promised a restoration of normalcy in Benghazi. He was going after militias. But then many people I talked to had a sense of buyer's remorse, right? Look, we supported this guy, but then in the areas that he's controlled, he's implemented restrictions on freedom of the press. He's actually allowed Islamists freedom in the social space. So people were saying, look, we didn't sign up for this. So there's huge amount of, I think, dismay about this man and his ambitions and the bargain, really, that comes with supporting him.
As it was mentioned earlier, Donald Trump basically contradicted Secretary Pompeo about a little over a week later on support for Haftar. Do any of you know what the current State Department position is on who the United States is supporting, if anyone, in Libya? Does anyone have any idea? Okay, all right, no one has any idea. So let me say, I oppose their intervention of Western powers, including the United States, to take out Gaddafi. I thought it was going to result in a power vacuum and potentially result in a worse case than when he was in control. That looks like what we have now, and it's resulted in this massive humanitarian crisis. So my question now is for Ms. Doherty. The National Organization for Migration estimates that the current fighting in Libya has displaced nearly 60,000 civilians. The IOM considers more than 3,400 migrants detained in and near Tripoli to be at high risk of harm. So what are the UN and others doing to protect refugees and civilians inside Libya?
So the UN and humanitarian partners are responding to the best of their ability given the current conflict right now. So IOM is trying to access detained migrants and provide services. The UN Refugee Agency has actually called for all detained migrants and refugees to be released, particularly the ones that are in conflict zones awaiting the front lines. The World Health Organization has about 12 emergency medical teams that they're supporting, and with additional backup teams that are rushing in to the front lines and trying to provide support. Unfortunately, they are doing so at great risk. I mentioned earlier they've lost 12 ambulances, and they've also faced loss of life and injury. So there is a response. It is being mounted right now by many actors, and this is also an opportunity for the U.S. to ensure that the humanitarian response is funded.
When you say they lost 12 ambulances, are these because of what Haftar is doing or what the government is doing, or both?
So it's very hard to get granular details and attribution, but to the best of my understanding, most of the ambulances have been lost because of shelling and in the crossfire. There was one attack on May 8th. The director of the Tripoli Ambulance and Emergency Services lost his legs in a grisly attack, and the ambulance was taken, and that appears to have been by LNA forces, but further investigation is required.
All right, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Liu. It looks like votes are about to be called, which will leave just enough time for Ms. Omar and me. Ms. Omar, you're recognized. Please.
Thank you, Chairman Deutsch, for allowing me to join you in this subcommittee. I think my line of questions were sort of addressed a little bit by Mr. Liu, and I just kind of wanted to see if we can expand on that. I know right now that the conflict and the new reiteration of the civil war is putting a lot of Somali and Eritrean refugees who have been in prisons, who are waiting resettlement in danger, and their particular removal hasn't been decided on. And so I wanted to see if you can maybe give us further details to what you just stated on what their state is and how the United States can assist more particularly in that area.
Thank you for that question. And I'll note that even before the conflict, refugees and migrants in detention centers faced atrocious human rights abuses and inhumane conditions. Our ability to help them is even further limited by the fact that we are now in a full conflict. So the best way that we can protect these vulnerable people is to apply diplomatic pressure to end the conflict. But until we get there, we need to ensure that they are not in conflict zones and that they can be safely evacuated, where their claims can be processed and they can be treated for injuries. We saw on April 23rd that militias attacked the Qasr Ben Gashar detention facility, injuring many migrants and refugees who were already facing abominable conditions. So what we're seeing on the ground as this goes forward are more threats, more loss of life to these extremely vulnerable people. And I'll also note that there are even more refugees and migrants who are outside of detention centers, and they do not have access to the same protections or services as regular Libyan citizens who rely on social networks and who rely on families to take them in. So if we look towards how the US can help in this situation, obviously ending the conflict, but also helping make sure that Libyans that are intercepted at sea are not returned to a war zone. These detention centers are running out of food and they're being attacked. So it's not safe to return them. We should also be willing to look at levers for punishing those who violate international humanitarian law, and I hope that the US Congress will look into this further.
I appreciate that. I was on the same thought process of Mr. Liu. I really oftentimes don't understand people who think that we are able to save more lives by asking for regime change or by interfering in situations that oftentimes will exacerbate with our intervention. And I felt like that would be the case in Libya. And the Somali diaspora used to say Libya will become the next Somalia. And in many cases, it's had more atrocities occur than in Somalia. One of those is the modern day enslavement that's taking place in Libya, and I know that there aren't a lot of reports that are being focused on that. You don't see that on the evening news. But since you've spent a significant amount of time in Libya, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about the status of the trafficking and the enslavement of African migrants, and what the international community has been doing and what could be done further.
Thank you. So migrants are still being abused and also sold. Often they're sold to people who want to, if they have wealthy families, they'll ransom them. They're also sold for forced labor. It is a true travesty. There had been efforts both by the United States and other international partners to address some of these systemic human rights abuses, both to improve conditions in detention centers, but also to address the slave auctions and the horrible things that we saw. In fact, the international community had been working with the GNA. I believe there were 200 arrest warrants issued in relation to an incident involving slave auctions. So there had been some very fragile but important steps towards addressing these issues. The problem is now there's no way to do that in the middle of a conflict.
Thank you. I think I'm running out of time. Mr. Chairman, I hope once we sort of are past this conflict that you'll dedicate some time on this committee in addressing this particular atrocity that is taking place in Libya. Humans cannot be sold and us not respond. So thank you.
Thank you for raising it, Ms. Omar. As we wrap up, let me just ask, there have been suggestions about the need to ask the administration to clarify its policy. It's been suggested that the United States needs to lead at the United Nations. There's been a lot of discussion about the confusion surrounding the president's phone call with Haftar. My question as we wrap this up is be specific. Is there a framework at the United Nations that can work, and what specifically should the United States do to help lead it? Anyone? Dr. Wary.
I think for all of its flaws, the UN roadmap of a national conference and an eventual push toward elections was the right one. Although, again, we have to be careful about a rush to elections. I think that was one of the problems in 2012. We rushed to elections without having certain frameworks in place, security. So I think elections right now would be inadvisable. Again, I think a high-level presidential reversal of that statement, clarification is absolutely needed, because if American diplomats are still trying to adopt a more moderate, centrist approach, supporting some sort of ceasefire or something, it doesn't help that statement's out there, right? And so again, I think a very visible public statement is absolutely needed. I think one of the big problems of the UN process was it was not inclusive enough. So again, that was one of the focuses, the points of this national conference, was to sort of widen the circle to include armed groups. There was never really a security track, and so people like Haftar could stand out and later sabotage it. So you've got to talk to these militias. There needs to be a roadmap for building a new security architecture. And I'll just close with something very important. There were actually talks before this war between different armed factions, between different officers, about unifying the army. So there are these contacts ongoing, and I think the United States could play an important role in shepherding those talks and moving them forward.
Thank you. So, Ms. Doherty, I'm going to give you the last word here because we have to get to votes.
I appreciate that. I will just conclude then by saying that I agree with Fred's comments on inclusion and supporting a process that doesn't rush towards elite-led negotiations or elections, that U.S. diplomacy has played an important role in Libya before, and that we can continue to support the UN, specifically through a United Nations Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire and future secondments and technical assistance. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks so much to all the witnesses. This was an exceptional hearing. Thanks for your testimony. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions. We ask that they be submitted, that the witnesses respond to those in writing. I request that my colleagues, to the extent they have questions, submit them within 5 business days to the subcommittee clerk. And with that, without objection, this subcommittee is adjourned.